Hello, and welcome to the Flash History Podcast. I'm your host, Billy Blanchard, and in today's episode, I'll be covering the Winter War of 1939-40. The Winter War was fought between the Soviet Union and Finland, and would last 3.5 months before an eventual peace deal. Whilst the Soviets came out as victors, the blows the Red Army suffered at the hands of the Finns would damage its reputation, and as a result of its ineffectiveness, would convince Adolf Hitler to pursue an invasion of the Soviet Union. On the 30th of November 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland with 450,000 men and began bombing the Finnish capital, Helsinki, the same day. War had been expected by the Finns for well over a month. In early October, the Soviets had pestered the Finnish government for land concessions and had invited them for talks in Moscow. After the Russian requests were rejected, the Soviet Union unilaterally severed its ties with Finland and renounced their non-aggression pact. Spearheading the Soviet attack was the 7th Army, led by Commander Vsevolod Yakovlev, whose primary objective was the securing of the Karelian Isthmus and the capture of Finland's second city, Viipuri. If all went according to plan, the army would then push towards the northwest, where, after 3 weeks of fighting, it would take Helsinki and end the war. However, the Soviets lacked specific information about the Finnish fortifications, and its estimate of 3 weeks was an overly optimistic target. On the 7th of December, the Soviet troops reached the Mannerheim Line. The line was an array of Finnish defence structures located approximately 20 miles from the Soviet border. In the occupied territory, a puppet government known as the Terezhouki government was set up by the Soviets, who named it after the first village they captured. With very few anti-tank weapons, the Soviets initially caused havoc amongst the Finnish soldiers as they drove their tanks in a frontal assault. However, the heavily forested terrain allowed the Finns to use their surroundings to destroy the Soviet tanks at close range. The first assaults also gave birth to a famous type of weapon, the Molotov cocktail, a name referring by the Finns to the Soviet foreign minister. Meanwhile, in eastern Finland, the Soviets reached a small village called Suomussalmi. The village had been destroyed by the Finns on the 6th of December to deny the Soviets any means of shelter. Whilst the Soviets took the village with relative ease, they quickly found themselves stuck, as the terrain was highly favourable for the Finns. To the west were a long string of frozen lakes, and 2 Soviet assaults across them catastrophically failed. The Finns quickly responded with a counterattack on the village, led by Colonel Silavusu, but failed and suffered heavy losses. Over the next few weeks, the two sides tried countlessly to force the other out of the village and its surroundings. The Finnish finally broke through on the 27th of December, taking the village and causing the entire Soviet 9th Army to retreat. When the battle finally ended on the 8th of January 1940, 750 Finns had lost their lives. Yet, the Soviet losses were far more calamitous, at an estimated 25,000 killed. The Battle of Suomussalmi was a perfect representation of the Soviet forces during the first 2 months of the war. They were poorly led and with zero knowledge of the tactics they were supposed to utilise. However, the tides of war soon began to shift in the Soviets' favour. Stalin had appointed a new commander, Semyon Timoshenko, on the 7th of January, who, a month after his appointment, sent fresh Soviet troops to the Finnish battlegrounds. Timoshenko switched the main Soviet focus towards the Karelian Isthmus because, despite the challenging terrain of forests and lakes, Karelia was the industrial heartland of Finland, and securing it would bring the war to an end. This shift in strategy coincided with the Soviet decision to not capture the entirety of Finland. Instead, the focus would be on securing an appropriate buffer zone north of Leningrad. Finland's pleas for help on the international stage were met with very little reception, besides diplomatic support. With Britain and France fully focused on the war ensuing in Central Europe, Finland's only source of aid came from neutral Sweden, who had declared herself a non-belligerent in the war, sending only military and medical equipment. By the 11th of February 1940, the Soviets had amassed almost 500,000 men, 3,000 tanks and 1,300 aircraft on the Karelian Isthmus. The Soviets advanced in small numbers, with tanks protected by squadrons of infantry, making it difficult for the Finns to destroy them. 4 days later, Field Marshal Mannerheim ordered a full-scale retreat from the western half of the line towards the city of Viipuri. With the Finnish defensive breach, the Soviets broke through the Mannerheim line and pushed towards Viipuri, capturing the city on the 5th of March. The Finnish situation was now bleak, and they were desperately seeking a peace deal with the Soviets. On the 12th of March 1940, the Moscow Peace Treaty was signed. The Soviet Union acquired the entirety of the Karelian Isthmus, including Viipuri, and parts of northern Finland as well. The Finns would lease the port of Hanko in western Finland to the Soviets for 30 years, which would give the Soviets more influence in the Baltic region. Finland had lost 11% of its territory and 30% of its economy as a result of the treaty. However, the price the Soviets had to pay for these demands was astronomical. In a war that was expected to last 2 weeks, the total Soviet casualties were upwards of 330,000. The Finns, despite being defeated in the war, lost only 26,000 men, with a further 43,000 wounded. The Soviet Union would emerge out of the Winter War as victors only in name. Internationally, their reputation had been destroyed, whilst Finland gained worldwide accord for standing up to a much greater foe. The war would be a deciding factor in Adolf Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union in December 1940. Finland would take part in Operation Barbarossa on the 22nd of June 1941 and will regain much of its lost territory until ultimately surrendering to the Soviets in 1944. Thank you for listening to the Flash History podcast. If you enjoyed and want more historical content, be sure to subscribe to this podcast and follow us on Twitter at @Flash_History.